to make your notes, and also find that chat function. And if you can, just find that chat function and just let us know where you're connecting from. I always love to see where across the region and the world our participants join from. David and I are here in Sydney. It's been a great couple of weeks. David is lucky for us. We've had David here in the region the last couple of weeks doing a number of events and speaking to our clients out here. So kia ora, Helen from Bay of Plenty there in New Zealand. Hi, Ravi from Yokohama. Yanga from Melbourne, a number from Brisbane and Sydney. Deirdre from Sri Lanka, thank you for making the time. I know the time difference is perhaps not as friendly for you, so I really appreciate you joining. So lots of people from Sydney, Brisbane, across Australia, Singapore. Hi, Kathleen. Millie from Dallas, Texas. Thank you also. It must be quite late for you, so I appreciate you taking the time to join us today. So thank you all. As I said, use that chat function as we go. But before we'd like to kick off by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which David and I are presenting from today. That's the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation here in Sydney. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and any that may be joining us today. So let's kick into the content. As I said, this is a session, a bit more of a conversational style between David and myself today, talking about the big 5 key trends and insights that we're seeing across 2024. So I'd like to invite David into the conversation. For those who may not be entirely familiar with David, David is our co-founder and CEO. Founded the Neuroshift Institute 26 years ago now, so it's our 26th year. Not my 14th year with the company. David is a well-renowned expert in this space, author, has lots of publications on fast companies like Today, Harvard Business Review, etc., and coined the term neuroleadership. So David, welcome.
Thanks very much, Jeff. Great to be here. Great to be back in Sydney, where I'm from originally. You'll have to excuse my sometimes American twang. You have to soften the accent over there. They don't understand you, and it's a fascinating place, that's for sure. But it's great to be home.
Excellent. Great. So let's start into the conversation. Some big trends and some re-emerging trends that we're seeing, particularly from work that we've done in 10 years ago, that are sort of resurfacing with new edge and a new angle. So just wanted to start off with, you've been talking to a lot of executives, particularly across Asia Pac, about what skills leaders will need now and into the future. And so what have you been hearing about the shift and what the future new leader is going to need?
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, one of the really fun parts of my job is I get to listen to a lot of people who are listening to a lot of people. I get to talk to many chief people officers and CEOs of larger companies, right across the globe, particularly in North America and this region, but also in EMEA. And I get to, ask them the question, what's really happening in your people function? What are you doing with leadership? And really, ask a lot of questions. And we gather a lot of data on these questions, and we also just sort of informally notice trends. So it's been fascinating. The last few months, I had the opportunity to spend half a day with pretty large groups of CEOs, about 20 CEOs at a time, many times in North America, and just kind of what's important for you around leadership and all this. The cliff note is about half of what leaders need to do now is really quite different. So they're about 50. What we're seeing from our research is about 50% of what leaders need to do is really, they're quite new skills. The obvious one that jumps out is understanding AI transformation, right? But there's actually quite a few others. For the first time, they've got to really be able to lean into things like burnout in their organization, mental health issues in their organization. Really lean into a lot more constituents they have to manage. Across whether it's public sector or private sector, all sorts of things. So maybe about half the skills that leaders need now are new, and the other half are things they've always needed, but now they need to be much better at them, like a lot better at them, and they're more important, right? So let's say, connecting with people so that they feel that they can trust you and, that you're authentic in that way. Like that was always pretty important. But now when people feel really disconnected, in a hybrid workplace, for example, or just from world events, it's even more important, but it's also harder to do, um, in these environments. So most of the skills that have always been important now are a lot more important and harder to do. And then there's a bunch of new skills. So there's a lot of energy around kind of redefining leadership now. And we've been working with some fantastic Australian organizations, one of the biggest banks, the big telcos, Coles, a number of others, to kind of rethink their whole approach to leadership, how they define it, as well as how they'll build it, but really rethinking their definition of leadership itself. And it's a really, really interesting process. It makes companies kind of ask a lot of hard questions of themselves. What really matters? Where does accountability live versus other things? Is it equal to psych safety, for example? So it's a really interesting time. And just, on that theme, I think there's three sort of broad themes that we're seeing. And it's interesting. I've never seen so much convergence right now around similar themes across companies. And I think it's because of the pace of technology change and the challenges humans are having with a lot of things. But I think there's sort of this is like a tripod with three legs, right? There's growth mindset, first of all. There's just everywhere. Everyone's wanting to work on helping people adapt faster. And, we've been in that space for 10 years, done some really fascinating projects with some of the world's, really fascinating companies on this topic. So growth mindset, we've probably helped 400 or 500 organizations, totally millions of people now, really build that culture of growth mindset. But it's seen as a really critical foundation for leaders now. They've got to adapt faster, learn faster, help their people learn faster, all of this. The second one is psychological safety. We just had a half-day mini summit on this just yesterday in Sydney, but psychological safety, which is not about kindness or empathy. It's actually a very high order skill. It's quite a challenging skill, in fact, of sort of in everyday vernacular, it's like arguing well and still being friends at the end of it, right? But the arguments work, like people really debate robustly, what's going on, and the best ideas come out, not the loudest voices, right? So it's beyond inclusion, right? It's beyond, but it builds on that. It's beyond just kind of do people speak up, but it builds on that. It's really like creating the conditions where people are in this sweet spot of kind of challenging each other. So it's not too much, right? But it's not too little. The sweet spot of challenging each other just the right amount and in just the right way, such that the best innovations come out, the best ideas, a lot fewer mistakes, things are optimized, all that. So that's psych safety, right? So you want growth mindset in terms of this overall approach. You want psych safety, which is not about just everyone being kind. It's actually about safe arguing in a way, right? And then the third one that sort of balances these two is accountability. And we're seeing an increased focus on accountability this year. In fact, next week, I have a webinar with, which will turn into a podcast with Amy Edmondson, who's one of the world's experts in this. And we're specifically focusing on that session on the relationship between psych safety and accountability and how they're really the same thing and all the different ways they kind of work together. So growth mindset, psych safety, accountability, we think are the big themes right now that leaders need to be much better at. And all of them have sort of always been important, but now they're even more important and harder to do in this environment as well. So that's kind of what we're seeing overall.
And I suppose sort of from that, identifying these are the big skills to develop, and say 50% the new skills. How do we do that? What are we seeing in terms of developing leaders and developing talent?
Yeah, but before we get that, let's maybe take some questions or sort of reflections from the audience as well, before we sort of get into the really interesting innovations that are happening in development.
From Paul, the topic of radical candor, about care and challenge. How does that arise when we talk about psych safety?
Yeah, it's interesting. So we have one of the habits that we have is called challenge kindly. And so we've been working with Amy. We partnered with her, licensed her research, and we built the much more tactical kind of buildable habits underneath her framework. So her framework is set the stage, invite participation, respond thoughtfully. And we said, okay, well, what are the cognitive habits, the habits of mind you need underneath, say, respond productively? Like what exactly does that look like? And one of the most important things is what we would call challenge kindly. And I think that the sort of radical candor movement, I think what that misses is just how threatening it is to give feedback, to be candid, and just how hard you've got to work for that conversation to actually be useful. And those of you who know our work, obviously SCARF plays into that, which is the social domains of status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, fairness. But essentially the threats that you create when you're really direct with someone, it's all very well to be really candid, but you need to do it in a way that minimizes how threatened people feel by it. And there's some really powerful techniques for that we've learned over the years. So, one of them is like get people to give themselves feedback. Like 3/4 of the time, they actually do a really good job of that without the threat from you, right? Like a lot of the time. So challenge kindly is a really important one. It's probably the most difficult skill to learn, the most high impact, right? And the most beneficial. So it's a really big one.
And
Another question.
and I remember what you were saying yesterday about the importance of taking a coaching style in that to get the insight in the other person, rather than when I'm challenging, just telling you what I think it should be. Helping the other person come to the insight. As part of that challenging kindly.
Yeah, there's some basic sort of structural flaws, I believe, in the kind of radical candor concept, which is that it's sort of like encouraging people to finally say things they've always wanted to say, and that's not necessarily the best approach. Like what we found is at a cultural level, the best way to get information flowing is get people to ask for feedback, right? When you ask for feedback or input or guidance or perspective, when you do that, you're so much more likely to process the information better. But also the person giving it to will actually process it much better. So it's a much richer dialogue, and it's really the only way we've found of turning down that threat response that happens. Whereas if you just say, "Hey everyone, be candid," what will happen is there'll be a lot more threat response happening. Now, is candid better than not candid? Yes, but candid in a really clever way that minimizes threat is by far the better option. And so that's one of the interesting challenges. Now, what happens when that kind of conversation works is a person goes, "Oh, I'm going to do that differently." What that looks like in the brain, you could call it a moment of insight. It's driven by a process called mental contrasting. That's quite a complicated process of like holding two completely different strategies in mind, right, and seeing why this one's better. So you got to facilitate really complex self-reflection. And then this insight moment happens, and then that really motivates people. So the purpose of sort of those feedback conversations or any of those difficult conversations is people changing, but we miss the fact often that people are so much more likely to change if they feel the idea is theirs and they don't feel threatened by you and all that. So that's there's a whole lot of really interesting stuff in psych safety. We sort of see it as pretty advanced skill that builds on kind of overall having a growth mindset, overall being inclusive, overall, people being in the habit of speaking up. And then now how do we create the conditions to really kind of debate well and challenge each other and all that. So that's kind of how we see it.
Another question from Karen about how do we define accountability? When we're talking about accountability,
Yeah, it's an interesting one. We're actually doing a lot of research on it at the moment. We've been close to this topic for a long time because when you teach coaching, you're teaching how to get people to really do what they say they're going to do, right? Which is kind of one definition of accountability. People do what they say they're going to do. So if you're a coach and you're helping someone set a plan for the week of what they want to do, you want to do that in such a way that it actually happens and it's actually helpful. Right? There's a lot of thinking in that for the coach. Like, how do I make this action the person's going to set helpful and happen? And so, we've been working in that for a long time, 25 years. And then more recently in the last year, we started thinking a lot more deeply about the mechanics of accountability and what it takes. And you'll see more work coming out on that shortly. But one of the mechanisms is you're mentalizing, which is this complicated word for thinking deeply about the thing you want someone to do and what's likely to happen when they go do it, right? So you're imagining like all the things that could go wrong, all the kind of ways this person maybe messes up other ways, right? But also like, how do you make it super clear? How do you, like, if you were reading this, how would you interpret this? Are there ways you need to clarify, synthesize, simplify maybe, right? And so you're really thinking deeply about the sort of task that you're giving someone, such that you've really thought through every angle and made the task as likely to happen as possible and to be helpful, right? So that's kind of a piece of accountability. It's actually owned by the person giving a task, right? And then as a receiver of a task, you kind of want to do the same thing. Think really deeply and honestly about, am I really going to be able to do this? I'm committing to this 100%. So before I commit, how do I really make sure I can do this, right? So that you always do what you say you're going to do, right? So there's a sort of two sides of that. And then and at the end of the day, it's people doing what they say they're going to do. But there's a lot of complexity in that, but definitely a lot of mentalizing on both sides. And some other sub skills that we've been studying and looking at how to teach, really deeply.
And that real challenge of, when you ask for something, you've got your biases that come into play, and that, so much of the culture change work that I do, in our thinking partnerships is around this question of clarity and, being clear when you ask people, are you communicating in a way that actually makes them understand what the ask is, what their boundaries is.
Yeah,
and not just
absolutely
giving a high vision without that detail.
Yeah, there's a lot of bias and stuff going on in there for sure as well.
Well, let's jump into sorry. Any other sort of questions?
Yeah, no, just I think was there any other questions? No, I think some good questions there. Let's continue. I think the summary would be leadership's become harder and more important and different. And all of that says that we need to be better at developing leaders, today.
So how do we do that? What we've been looking, over at least the 14 years that I've been here and before that, of how we make learning better and easier. What are we seeing in your discussions and what we're thinking about here at NLI?
So it's a really interesting time to be in leadership development, because it's a field that's just really like long overdue for disruption, like serious disruption. Because you think about, you need a car, so you go onto an app, and in a couple of buttons, a couple of seconds, you've got an Uber on the way, right? And it can tell you exactly how long it's going to take. You want to go somewhere, you can book a flight in a couple of minutes, you can get a house in a couple of minutes, you can do everything from this remote control device, right? And then you're like, oh, you need to be better at feedback. Okay, well, I'm going to book into a class. That'll take 5 minutes, right? The class is in a month. It's a half a day or a day. And you'll get there, and most of what you learn is not relevant, and, it really won't stick, right? Now, some people, so that's sort of the in-person paradigm. It's extremely inefficient, but also really ineffective. And, we study we study habit activation at scale, and we've got data on, how well people build habits. Like a month after an experience, what percentage of a larger audience has the habit that you wanted? If it was about better feedback, what percentage of people are actually doing better feedback? And so we track that kind of thing, and it turns out workshops are really the worst at that of all the other forms of learning, because they're one-off and they have no spacing and they cram too much in and all sorts of things. But that's sort of the go-to model, right? Or a leadership program, a 2-day, 3-day, 4-day offsite at Harvard, or RMIT here or somewhere, and so the sort of in-person model is the go-to. But a lot of people have said, all right, why don't we make this self-serve? And so you've got a lot of platforms out there like Harvard Managed Mentor and Skillsoft and all these things that, in theory, you can just go onto and find that, that kind of, learning that you need. The trouble with that is that soft skills have a really long history of poor usage by leadership, leaders and in leadership development. And essentially there's this sort of inverse correlation between how much you need a skill and how likely you are to use a platform. And this stuff gets used by people who really don't need it and are really growth orientated and love to learn. And the people who need to be better leaders just don't use these platforms because they don't think they need them. So you end up back at the, forcing people into a room situation. So you've sort of got that. And then, along has come some innovations in coaching, because coaching is one of these great things that actually follows ages. You get high attention, high generation, high emotion, and high spacing. Ages is the 4 conditions that create really strong insight and learning and make learning stick. And maybe one of my team can put an ages piece in the chat. But anyway, what you see is coaching is great, but the problem with coaching is it is a number of problems. One is it doesn't scale very well. Even when you make it digital, it's really hard to get, if you've got 1,000 leaders, to get 1,000 leaders into coaching engagements. And secondly, it's pretty expensive, even when you're doing it digitally. But the third problem with it, which is sort of not obvious, is if you have 1,000 managers and you want to develop them, you give them, let's say 100 coaches or whatever between the 1,000 managers. Firstly, all that information leaves the organization, right? You actually are more likely for those people to leave the organization themselves. So external coaching is correlated with a slight increase in losing people, right? But the big thing is you've got 1,000 different conversations happening and nothing being shared across that group. So everyone's learning something different models, different ideas. There's no shared language. There's no shared learning, none of this stuff. So it doesn't actually feel like leadership development. It feels like personal development, which is great, but it's not necessarily, what the organization, can do best from. So we've been thinking for a long time, how do you kind of solve this? And, we went back to the drawing board about 10 years ago because we were most of our work was in person 10 years ago. And we said, how do we really scale better? And we stripped away everything. We looked at the Aegis model and we said, is there a way to like radically rethink how you do leadership development? We came up with these two really different ideas, very, very different at the time. And at the time, we thought maybe they will be half as effective as in-person learning. What we found is both of them are much more effective than in-person learning at habit activation. Separately, much cheaper, much faster, and can scale dramatically better, right? You can put 100,000 people through one of these learning experiences that's 50% better than in-person learning, right? For an absolute fraction of the cost and really fast, like in a few months. So much better ways of doing learning. We've been challenging ourselves again just in the last year to sort of think of a different way of doing this that has the real ability to scale and also collect data and really learn. And so we think there's a way to do this digitally, but you still keep the high impact learning that comes from social interaction. So you're online, but you're still got social interaction, insight learning, which is how people change, and then over time. And so we've been experimenting. We're just launching this month, literally February, we're launching a solution called Lead. And Lead exists on what we're calling a habit activation platform. So a habit activation platform for us is a platform where a cohort goes and they learn together over a period of time, maybe a month if it's a growth mindset. If it's all the foundational, leadership and management skills people should have, we can do that in 6 months, right? So you can say, new managers, middle managers, even senior managers can all have the same language, but just like digital coaching, they can actually do this, online, but also be getting shared language and really learning from each other, and really growing and developing that way. So it's a really fascinating experiment for us. And for the first time, we're actually doing open enrollment of a solution like this. So maybe one of my team can put a link in the chat and you can check that out later. But Lead is essentially Lead is the name of it. It's a 6-month digital solution in cohorts, inside companies or public. And it actually takes you through all the critical habits around managing yourself, mobilizing others, and driving results. And you might add in person to it.
15 minutes a week. That's
15 minutes a week for 6 months. Yeah. But you might drop in and out, do 2 minutes and then 5 minutes the next day. And a few days later, do a couple of minutes. But over the week, about 15 minutes with all the different, habits. So not a big commitment. So we've launched that. And we're actually shifting all of our work onto this habit activation platform idea, where you can impact a lot of people really quickly and get data and still get the benefits of learning. So we think these things can still be more effective than in-person learning at habit activation, but radically cheaper and faster. So that's what we're experimenting with. So there are other interesting innovations out there, there's all sorts of VR stuff coming out that's really fascinating, that puts you in kind of a simulation where you're really there. I love that stuff. The problem is it doesn't scale very easily. You've got to get devices to people. Even if you don't, there's a lot of software, a lot of complexity. It's really hard to build these things. So I do think, that's really interesting. And maybe at some point we'll sort of hit its stride. I think obviously AI is giving us the ability to do some really amazing things. We've actually built an AI coach into our platform, so it's being powered up with everything that we've published and written, and all our IP. So you'll be able to ask this avatar, like, hey, how do I give better feedback? What do I do about this conflict happening? How do I manage my emotions better, etc. So I think that AI's got some interesting things, and then simulations, as I said, also really interesting, but again, sort of harder to scale. But there are a lot of interesting things happening in leadership development, but I think the real challenge is, how do you create real change and do it at scale, and do it in a way that feels like getting an Uber or grabbing an Airbnb? How do we do it as seamlessly as that, but still have a consistent experience across people in that organization, and really create that sustained change? So that's our big goal at the moment.
And it's that's about and one of our core culture principles at NLI, make it easy. How can we make it easy for people to access the content and get into these systems? That intuitive learning experience that people can, like I said, slot in 5 minutes when you've got that spare on a particular day,
Yeah.
rather than going off site, and then coming back and you've still got your work to do.
Yeah, and Emily's asking an interesting question, just like what, how does it differ to sort of doing in-person training virtually, like on a Zoom? I guess you mean that in-person and virtually we see as different things, but I guess you mean like real time, but virtually. I mean, we do a lot of that. We do a huge amount of taking people through a month-long experience of, say, 3 Zoom sessions over that month. And the wonderful thing about spreading it out is you can get people really focused for that time, and then give them assignments to go away and do, and come back. It's a wonderful thing. The thing is, it just has some non-obvious friction. Even that has a lot of non-obvious friction, which is scheduling, getting people to turn up, following up when they don't, all these kinds of things. Whereas if you basically say, hey, look, all 1,000 leaders in this company are going to be together going through this leadership journey, one person's going to move really quickly through it, then come back and jump around. The next person's going to move slowly. The next person's going to do it with a few cohorts and other people. And, it's very personalized. And people are going to sort of stop and start and really focus where they want. So you can impact a lot more people, but still maintain the social element. So I think it's just it's a reducing friction without reducing impact. That's our goal there.
Another couple of questions there from Paul around customizing it and bringing in an organization's values and lead principles, etc. Into that development.
Absolutely. Look, we're actually doing a demo. I think it's next week or the week after. Yeah. Maybe you can put the link in the chat, Jeff, or just the date to hold the time and date. But we're doing a demo of that. I don't want to talk too much about the product and get sidetracked in that, but we're doing a 25-minute demo, and you'll see the platform. You'll see all sorts of really cool stuff to really dig into it, and also that link. So maybe I'll save some of those questions coming up. But I think the summary here is leadership development's really ripe for disruption. We're doing some really, we think, very exciting things. There's some other exciting things in the space, but we think there's something really big in particularly in medium to larger organizations. There's something really big in a habit activation platform that people can kind of learn at their own pace, but still be learning with others, and really creates insight and gets people to set actions like coaching, but gives them a consistent language across the business. So back to you, Jeff.
Alrighty, well, let's move on to our next of the big five. How we talk and position DEI in organizations. So we've been seeing some shifts here in Australia following the voice referendum last year, in just how do we actually start packaging and talking about DEI strategies in organizations. So what are you seeing in terms of shifts? And I know the North American experience is quite different, but probably a lot that we can learn from that as well.
Yeah, America's in some ways 2 countries, right? It's a red country and a blue country. And you see that here in the media, and they sort of really don't see the same world. So about 50% of organizations that we saw in a study are actually investing more in DEI at the moment. I think it was 52% or something. They're really working harder on DEI. And then you've got a percentage that are, aggressively cutting DEI. The net effect, and we looked at this sort of curve question, the net effect of all of this in North America is that the growth in kind of investment in DEI has definitely slowed, but it hasn't gone backwards. It hasn't gone down. So, it was really, really, really high in 2020 for obvious reasons. It slowed down a bit 2021, slowed down in 2022, 2023, but still very much going forward. And so the net effect of these two states, in a way, is there's still big investment and care and consideration for DEI. One of the things that we're seeing is actually something we published 7 or 8 years ago, companies finally starting to kind of listen to some of the things we've said, is that there are ways to do the really good work of DEI and minimize the negative reactions you get from all sorts of populations, right? For example, if you're doing inclusion work, why call out individual audiences around inclusion and create backlash from others who say, look, why are they getting all this stuff, right? Why wouldn't you just teach everyone to be more inclusive with everyone, right? Which doesn't mean everyone's in every meeting, right? There's a thing called optimal inclusion. But we published a long time ago that the right way to do inclusion was not to call out people and alienate others, but actually give everyone the understanding of how important inclusion is. And it really is important. It's, exclusion has a very real effect on people, not just their performance, but their longevity and, everything. So that's that's a different approach. Also around bias, like why not address bias by teaching people how to make better business decisions first? Right? Why don't we say, look, here are all the really, really difficult business decisions you have to make. Let's look at them through the lens of bias and make better ones, right? Oh, that's working great. Why don't we now look at the people decisions that we make, who we hire and all this other stuff, right? Rather than you've got to be less racist, you've got to be less sexist, you've got to, and you get this real reaction. So we've been looking at sort of, this has been our approach since the start. And what we're actually finding is it continues to be really, really popular in North America. And we're teaching some of these things to some, major government agencies there, and we were able to maintain that during the Trump administration as well. It never got canned. So I think there's a different approach. One of the really interesting people to follow in this space is Kenji Yoshino. He's a law professor. He's diverse in a bunch of ways himself. Really deep thinker and researcher and author on these topics. He wrote a book on covering, but he just spoke at our summit recently. And maybe my team can dig up that link and put it in the chat as well, or we can send it as a follow-up. But there's a clip of him kind of explaining what you really should do no matter what happens. So sort of legally, these are the things you should do because they're the right things to do, and they'll protect you if bad things do happen from a legal perspective in North America. And the cliff note is sort of do things that rise all boats, like some of the strategies I was just explaining, and a bunch of other things. But so we are seeing some companies, but again, it's a slowdown, not a reverse. We are seeing some companies say, well, we're not going to have a chief diversity officer anymore, or we're going to invest less. But then what you see is the leadership team, the team in charge of leadership, just quietly including weaving in inclusive leadership into their leadership development program. Oh, we don't have a D&I department now, but we're teaching inclusive leadership now when we teach leaders, right? So it's getting woven into the fabric of leadership programs and also the systems that you have. So you're seeing a lot more sort of weaving in rather than this kind of separate function. So that's definitely a trend that we're seeing.
Right. Any questions from the group on DEI? What are you seeing in your organization or the market in the country that you're from?
Yeah, and definitely the ESG is big, and probably going to get bigger and bigger. There's a lot of focus on that in organizations, and in this market, in Australia in particular, it's more of a priority than it is in some others, which is good to see. But just how to think about that, how to drive those changes across the business is definitely really important. That might be a good segue to sort of the earlier question about habit activation, because we've been actually thinking about this as it relates to ESG as well. We think that there is a real science of habit activation at scale that builds on how you help individuals build habits, but actually is a little different. There's a whole science and practice, just like there's a practice of architecture of big buildings that's builds on, but is different, but adds to the architecture of building houses, right? Building a big building, 100-story building, there are some foundations that are similar to building houses, right? But really is a lot of new things. We think it's similar if you're trying to impact 10,000 employees or 100,000 employees. There's some really important principles around how you build habits. that draw from how you might run a single program or help someone improve. But there's a whole lot of new insight around that. And so we've been developing kind of a school of thought and methodology and approach. We've worked out how to measure habit activation at scale with something called the behavior change percentage. We've looked at how we define those habits. So we're sort of slowly building an architecture around how you sort of how you think about architecture itself of of these things. So watch this space. There's more more coming out on that in time. But the meta framework I'll give you, then if you've been following our work, you've heard this before, but the meta framework is priorities, habits, and systems. And to really build habits at scale, you need very crisp, clear priorities. You then need to build habits the way habits actually get built. And then you need systems that support all that. So we've got a lot of thinking around each of those levels, but in particular around habit activation at scale. And one nugget that I'll give you is just, everyone thinks about sort of the top down, like way of driving change and learning and leadership stuff, which basically ends up with sort of spending a lot of money on the top and very little in the middle and nothing else on first line managers and all this. We actually would rather give a little bit of insight and content to everyone pretty quickly rather than invest a lot on the top. So we call that the everyone to everyone model instead of the top down model, right, of change. So habit activation at change, one of the big nuggets from us is like, think about the everyone to everyone model more so than the top down model when you're thinking about habit activation, but certainly a lot more, that we think about that.
And that's how we get that scale at speed. The waiting for that trickle down effect. Your changes will take years, but a little bit to everyone gets a bigger uplift. And again, back to that point from Kenji, rising all boats, lifting everyone's capabilities. Let's move into our next big and probably one of the biggest trend we're seeing this year is how do we think about performance management, particularly in a hybrid distributed team world. A lot of our clients here in APAC and particularly in Australia, increasing the expectation of return to office, but also having to balance people who really want to keep working from home.
Yeah. I mean, it's a whole complex topic. And it's been great for selling newspapers if they sell those things anymore, or subscriptions, I guess, because it's every new week there's a new headline like this company's forcing everyone back in and seem to be doing fine and all this stuff. And then you see the opposite, these people are all quitting because they're coming. So it's a very noisy space. I can tell you, some of the basics, and we've been talking about this for a while, but some of the basics are about a third of people believe they'll be much more productive if they're in the office full time and everyone else is. And that is probably true in terms of their own productivity. They have reasons like home situation or others where they want to be back in the office full time, but they find that it's frustrating without everyone there, right? But about a third of people are really passionate about working from home, and they believe they're more productive doing that, and they're generally right. They are more productive doing that than going in. And then there's about a third of people believe that they'll be most productive if they mix it up. If they, some time in the office, some time at home, all this. So it's really hard. So, if you, depending who you ask, right, you get different, biases about this whole issue. And if the CEO themselves is in that first category of, I'm more productive at the office when everyone's there, they're much more likely to just try to, bring everyone back. What we see is there's individual productivity, but there's also organizational productivity. And there's some research coming out that organizational productivity is different to individual productivity. Organizational productivity is like, how revenue growth and sales and innovations and things like that. And what we're seeing is that organizational productivity is probably better if in a hybrid environment, but when hybrid's done well, right? So that's, and individual productivity is probably better when most people are allowed to work from home, right? But what's hybrid done well? It doesn't mean you're coming in 2 days a week or 3 days a week. It's actually got to be done well so people feel that it's fair. They've still got some control. They know what's going to happen. So we developed a framework for sort of what we mean by doing this well. We call it the patchwork principle, and it basically the basic idea is bring people together once a month. No one thinks that's unfair. That seems really reasonable. Do useful things, right? Get teams collaborating. Do social things, put on food, but once a month, ask people to come in really reasonable. Once a quarter, ask them to come in a bit more. Right, so maybe it's 3 or 4 days once a quarter to do quarterly things, right? Again, really reasonable. And then by function, give people a number of days per month that you want them in, and do that fairly, right? There are some functions that really doesn't matter. It's like, okay, we only need you in 2 days extra a month just to hang out, right? Some functions you might need 8 days a month or 10 days a month, right? But give them the monthly number, not the weekly number and the days, and then let teams sort that out. So you got the marketing function. We think the marketing function, you should be in 8 days a month, but then off doing your own things. You guys work out if you want to do that over 2 weeks or 3 weeks or 4 weeks, however you do it. Just track largely to that number. So then the fourth element of the patchwork principle is basically people, the third of people who want to be there come in, right? And what they're finding is on more and more days, there's more and more people, and everyone starts to get the benefits of that. So that's that. We think that's the optimal way of kind of doing a hybrid well, where no one's feeling forced or treated unfairly, and all of this. I mean, there are organizations that for every employee, there's literally 1,000 amazingly qualified applicants who would do the job and would take the job immediately, and you'd find them fast. If you're in that industry, great, and you want everyone in the office because your CEO says, and you will lose a lot of people forcing people back. What you'll do is you'll hire people who live pretty closely or are willing to put up with the commute. What will happen is you'll lose a lot of women and parents, female parents and male parents, and also diverse people who tend to be further away. So there are all these downsides, to this as well. So, hybrid done well seems to be like the right answer. Now, that's a big preface. So how do you do performance management in this environment? And, in this environment where you're not seeing everyone all the time, you're either going to go to a surveillance mindset or an outcomes mindset. You sort of can't be in between. If you're not seeing everyone all the time, as a manager, you're either going to want to know everything everyone's doing, or you're going to realize you can't know everything everyone's doing. So you're going to focus on what the person's producing. And then you go, okay, well, how do I make sure they're producing right? You want to focus on outcomes, right? And on what great looks like. So a lot of performance management in this environment should be about shifting to that outcomes mindset. And then a lot of it is about speeding up the sort of, or deepening the coaching style of the manager, because you're not there watching the person work, right, as much. So you actually need to be that coach who debriefs at the end of the week with them, right? So you got to become better at having those conversations about their learning and growth. You're used to being literally on the side of the game, right, watching the game real time. Now you're watching some reruns at the end of the week. So a lot more coaching approach. One of the most effective kind of power tools, I think, for plugging into these systems is this culture of asking for feedback. What it does is it makes coaching much easier. It makes all of the feedback conversations much easier. What we see when people ask for feedback, it's about half as stressful for the giver and receiver, and it starts to flow much more fluidly. So, in a world where we need to be doing more coaching, get people asking their manager to give them input about how they're doing, and regularly. And you'll see the flow of that, happening much more. So we're doing a lot of work in that space. That's a big focus for companies is let's get, asking for feedback happening more. But there are 6 conversations in performance: goal setting, everyday feedback, check-ins, end of cycle, career and compensation, right? Those 6 conversations. Not a lot of change to the other elements. They just all need to be done with more care and thoughtfulness, more psych safety, more growth mindset, more accountability, right? But the feedback one is the one I think that companies can really benefit from really doubling down on, and create this culture of asking for feedback. So goal setting, everyday feedback, check-ins. The check-in is like at the end of a month or quarter. End of cycle, which might be the quarter or the year. Compensation and career. Those are the 6 conversations that can make up a performance strategy. What we saw is about 10 years ago, there was a big bump in companies kind of completely overhauling performance, getting rid of ratings, doing things differently. We're sort of seeing a big change happening again now, where companies are kind of coming back. They're not doing much with ratings. They're just looking at how do we make these much more fluid, much more coaching-like, much more developmental. And so we're doing quite a bit of consulting in that space as well.
Well, let's go to any questions around this topic of managing performance in our distributed team, hybrid, or even just performance management in general. If you're an organization that's got your hybrid working and flowing well, what have you been learning, or what would you like to ask? There is a question there from
And to
Karen
pause,
about measurement of these various approaches. We're very big on measurement here at NLI. What do you think there, Dave?
yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's actually a lot of research being done on these things. Like even if you take something like the 4-day work week, there's a lot of studies now coming out, all the time. So we find we're doing more synthesis of studies, synthesis of data than original studies. But there's a lot of great studies coming out on these things. And every few months we look at these again to say, hey, what's the data saying? And this is what we did recently. We saw that hybrid is better than like having everyone work from home. We were surprised by that, because there's studies showing working from home really increases productivity. Turns out that's true, but organizational productivity seems to be best in a thoughtful hybrid strategy.
Yeah.
But you've got to mitigate the downsides of just forcing people back, people feeling, that third of people feeling like they're wasting time at being asked to perform better. So that's what we sort of got.
If you think about, younger generations, early career people, that how they get that osmosis learning and interacting with mentors. Particularly, if senior leaders want to work from home, junior people want to be in the office, how are we being more present in that mentoring role, and sharing that information?
Yeah, definitely. So Emily's asking about feedback. We wrote a really interesting piece in Strategy and Business about feedback, and just kind of the research that we did on this. We did some research in Australia, actually, in a real lab, around kind of how you reimagine feedback completely. I'll put the link in the chat for you in a second. But so we've written a lot about this. We have a solution called Improve that you can look at. You talk to some of our people, but the cliff note is nothing addresses feedback as powerfully as creating a culture of asking. Like that's the variable that changes everything. If you ask well, people give it well. And if you teach people to ask well, they tend to keep doing it. Whereas when you teach people to give feedback, it's actually really painful a lot of the time. It doesn't land well. And so they really resist doing it again. Whereas asking for feedback people tend to be anxious going to do it, but then have a really positive experience and start more of a virtuous spiral. So something to think about there.
Alrighty, we're heading into the last big chunk. Keep the questions coming. We might have some extra questions along at the end. But the big thing that's on everyone's mind, and we talk a lot about threat in the brain, and a lot of our work is centered around that. Is this question of AI and its impact, and opportunity and impact of AI in both the talent function and organizations in more generally, given just the rapid changes, the uncertainty that it brings. So what should we be thinking about and looking out for when it comes to AI?
It's going to be a fascinating time. People are pretty anxious about it. The media is not necessarily helping with that in some ways. They love a good, wave of anxiety to get people reading. But yeah, it is going to be pretty fascinating. I mean, imagine a world before Google and search generally, right? If we had phones, but you couldn't actually search anything, right? You didn't have this is, I think, going to be much bigger than that. And the reason is that it's an interface breakthrough. And all the big interface breakthroughs in the past have been enormous, have been transformational. The touch screen on a cell phone didn't exist before Apple brought out the iPhone, right? Completely changed the way we pretty much do everything. Order cars, order, Airbnbs, date, everything is different because of this new interface. And it basically makes, interfacing with a computer much easier. But what the big thing I think AI is going to do is going to make interfacing with the computer even easier again in all sorts of ways. And remember when we went from sort of, computers with WYSIWYG, but now we're going to touch screens, so different, so much more fluent. I think we're going to get the same kind of fluency bump. So whole industries are going to be changed, and whole companies are going to have to change how they work with people. It's really hard to know how it's going to look. What we're seeing, first of all, is companies using this internally. We're looking to build one ourselves, like a bot that will, help you find anything, right? That knows everything and where everything is, and that it's kind of hard to do, but it can be useful. So I think companies are quite focused on sort of internal things. Now there's starting to be a wave of how do we use these things with sales and marketing and other things. But it's a really important thing to lean into with a growth mindset. It can look scary, but it's a really important thing to lean into. experimenting rapidly, trying things, getting feedback rapidly, doing these minimal viable product experiments and really iterating and experimenting. A lot of companies are not good at that. They want things to be really certain and spend a year finding a partner and then rolling something out in a year. And they've got to change their mindset to like, hey, let's do an experiment on our own staff for 2 weeks and then iterate and then iterate and then iterate. So it's putting some pressure on kind of adapting and innovation, which is why we're seeing growth mindset being such a big, staple in companies. So
and
need to be a lot
down
more,
to doubling capacity every 5 months in terms of what AI can do. Being able to sort of rapidly prototype and push things out.
Yeah, but it's one of those things that's taken over faster than anyone imagined. It's still very, very early days. Still feels a bit like 56K modem. It's amazing, but really still not that functional yet at the sort of speed that we need to go and all this. But it's it's getting woven in everywhere. Google just launched a camera that has it completely woven in. You can just take amazing pictures now, and now we can all create fake pictures like we never believed. So it has some dark sides, some upsides. But I think the big message for organizations is you've got to double down on growth mindset so that people, literally experiment much faster, simpler, easier, quicker, learn from these things and try them. And yeah, there's going to need to be some reskilling. There will be a wave of companies, laying off people in the next few years, but there's also going to be a wave of opportunity in there. So again, you need a growth mindset leading into that.
And a particular sort of interesting skill that I see coming out of it is how we as humans get better at asking questions. The challenge with AI, if you use ChatGPT and other tools, is the quality of the output is the quality of your input, the questions that you ask. So practicing that as a skill to develop in people, hopefully helps us work better with other humans.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it's going to be a really interesting time. How important is it to be speaking directly to a human versus an AI, and who do we trust and how do we trust them? All those things are really going to be interesting. I think just I'll just summarize. As we wrap up, I'll just summarize a few quick points. I think it's never been a more fascinating time to be working, to support humans in organizations. A difficult time, but really important. The work we're all doing is important. At NLI, our vision is making organizations better for humans and higher performing through science. But the big thing is, better for humans through science, and the neuroscience has been incredibly helpful to understand people at a deeper level and develop different strategies. And I think this year, I think the big push, and we're seeing this now, is companies really reimagining what a leader needs to do and what they need to learn and how they need to learn it. Drop us a line if you want to talk about that some more. Really easy for us to do a briefing for your executives, showing them the amazing work we've done with Microsoft and ANZ here, and Coles, many others. But really, really interesting time to be thinking about reimagining leadership going forward. That's a big trend. D&I sort of getting woven into the fabric is a really big trend. Sort of getting hybrid right for the long haul is a really big trend, and we think the patchwork principle is a big one there. Someone should put the patchwork principle article in the chat here as well, for folks. So those are some of the big trends I think overall. And then AI, it's about let's stay focused on that growth mindset.
Wonderful. So as Mel is saying, drop the word briefing into the chat if you'd like to follow up with us and have a deeper conversation, or demo if you're interested in joining one of our upcoming demos about that lead product. And we'll also just got a short poll if you can launch that, Melody, just of how we can follow up and the type of conversations that you're interested. We're always here to share our research, and look out for a follow-up email with all the links that David's been talking about today. Also just want to point out, we're getting back into some in-person of our coaching program. So our BBC brain-based coaching program will be doing in person in a few weeks here in Sydney. So if you're interested in that, we'll just tick off the personal education or put coaching into the chat.
One other quick comment before people jump off. If you are interested in lead, just put the word lead in the chat. We'll send the info out about the demo, but just put the word lead in the chat and someone will follow up with you and get you more information on that, including the demo info and also just perhaps have a one-on-one conversation with you. So just I see some of you working that out, put lead in the chat there. Fantastic. Thanks so much, Jeff. Thanks everyone for your interest in this work, and look forward to connecting with everyone.
Thanks, David, and thanks everyone. Have a great day. I'll just stay on for a couple seconds if anyone's got any extra questions or anything else to clarify. Happy to help. Thanks, Tracy. Thanks, Jenny. We will have a copy of this recording, Joni. So just look out for a follow-up email coming out from us, hopefully this afternoon or Monday. Thanks, Catherine. Thanks, Leo. Have a great day. Oh, thanks, Sasha, from Trinidad. Love you for that you made the effort. Thank you.